Would love to start with introductions. I am Kristina, she, they. Grew up in Pennsylvania, ended up in New York, and I have always been a storyteller with the goal of changing hearts and minds. And then when I realized that I was queer, I remember being in a hair salon, like reading a magazine, waiting. It was like How to Please Your Man. And in that moment, I suddenly saw the water that I had been living in and how much impact the stories that we tell and don't tell have on policy. And so I started telling stories of queer folks. And then once I realized the policy piece is really important to keep people safe while hearts and minds are changing at whatever pace they are. And so that's how I got involved in electoral work and coalitions and advocacy. Through that, I had the incredible experience of working with Barbara on a campaign recently, and we've kept in communication, and that's how this sort of unfolded. And so I'd love to pass to Barbara.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Smith. I live outside of Albany, New York, essentially in Albany, New York, which is unceded Haudenosaunee, Mohican, and Mohawk land. And I've been involved in political organizing since the early 1960s when I was in high school, and got involved in the civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement of that period in Cleveland, Ohio. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've worn a lot of hats in my fortunately long life. And one of the hats that I've worn that some people don't know about, I actually was an elected official on our city council in Albany from 2006 until 2013. I served 2 terms on the Albany Common Council. That's what we call our city council in Albany, but it's an elected position. I wasn't appointed. It's elected. You run in your ward. It's a typical, service, as far as I'm concerned, service position for where I lived, which is predominantly a poor, Black, poor and working class Black community, predominantly Black community. I've been a committed feminist since the early 1970s. My kind of entry into feminism was fortunately through Black feminism, not through the white women's movement per se. I attended the first Eastern Regional Conference of the National Black Feminist Organization. And people may be familiar with an organization that I was a co-founder of, which is the Combahee River Collective, based in Boston. That's how I know one of our dear panelists, who's Susan Moir. And we were originally a chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization. Since I mentioned Susan, I'm going to pass to her.
Thanks, Barbara and Kristina. I'm Susan Moir. I'm in Boston, where I have lived my entire life, just a few weeks in other places. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in a working class family, with all the benefits of white privilege in the post-World War II period, a good school system, single family home. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a high school cafeteria cook. With those limited resources, we had plenty because of, again, the benefits of white supremacy in this country. I was always queer and really out of place. And it didn't come out until I was in my mid-20s. By then, I had a 6-year-old son also, so I was a single mother and a dyke. Moved into Boston for community. I was on welfare, so I was able to go to school. I got through a long, tedious struggle. I had a bachelor's degree by the time I was 30. And did many different things, but mostly my family profession is driving. And I was a cab driver in Boston, and then a bus driver for many years, and a leader in the school bus drivers Boston and union in Boston, which was that union was an integral partner. So I was involved in the struggle for desegregation in Boston in two ways. One, by being a school bus driver, and another, a parent of my first generation of children went to the Boston public schools during the desegregation years. I'll say that, like in my 40s, at around 40, I got sober, and my entire life changed, and I transitioned to a middle class lifestyle, and the benefits of that. I went back to school. Got a graduate degree, got a job at UMass, and worked at two different campuses. For the building trades, I continued to do union work, but in a different position. And my younger generation of children have also are graduates of the Boston Public Schools. So I've had kids in the Boston Public Schools for about 52 years. And so I'm retired now. Because I made that career change at about 40, I have a pension, own my own home. And again, at the end of my life, still reaping the benefits of white supremacy in this country. I'll pass it to Mab.
Mab Segrest, 75 and a half this year. My trajectory really always starts in being born in Alabama in 1949 in an apartheid culture that was on the cusp or the verge of a radical movement for freedom and liberation that would transform my life. Tuskegee was in Macon County, which I was told, and I learned had the largest percentage of Black people of any county in the United States, maybe 85%, and had been one of those nodes of transformation with Tuskegee Institute and the Tuskegee Airmen, the VA hospital. 1954, Brown versus Board, Emmett Till, 55, Montgomery bus boycott. I was like 6 then, but I did grow up, and we got a television about that same time. I can remember sitting in the box with TV set, and so the news came directly to us at dinner, at lunch, and so forth. My dad had been a Republican since 1930, and my mom was very conflicted on race, knew what was the right thing, but afraid to do it. And we had 2 Black women who worked over generations, an aunt and a niece in my family, who really taught me, I think, the first Black feminism I had, or maybe the younger one, Belle, who was furious about racism and who let my mother know it, and who persuaded my mother to stop a Klan march in town. And my mother would drive her to Auburn to honor the boycott. So I was really surprised when my mother and father in 1963 helped to found a segregated private school. And my father went on to help to found a whole network of these schools in Alabama. And I ended up going to that school. And I wasn't surprised by my father. I was very surprised by my mother and disappointed, and kind of lived out that reality. Went to college in Alabama and knew that I needed to get out. I had a sense of myself as other outlier that turned out I was lesbian. But I also was just really asking a bunch of questions, like why, you know. And I remember this pivotal moment in church. I was singing in the choir. I loved the Methodist Church, grew up in it. Was the main thing to do after all the white people closed down the town when integration came along, so you could go to church. And there were stained glass windows. Last one on the wall was Jesus knocking at the door. And a certain point when SNCC workers were trying to get in or praying on the steps, the new role of welcomer would go back and lock the door. And so I would see this flurry at the back of the room, and I would know the doors being locked, and my father's when people were doing it. And I would look up, and I knew that Jesus knocking the door said, knock and it'll be open to you. And so I had, just in this kind of, I guess it's a 45-degree angle of moving my head, I had this sense of the profound contradictions in what I had been taught, the people who had taught me, and the basis of my culture, which professed Christianity and yet was locking people out at the very time, and that was one moment that really lived with me. Another was when the schools were integrated in 63. Tuskegee was one of 4 Black schools, and I'm going to go too long into this, but George Wallace sent 100 then 200 troopers to close the schools, and I was lying in the bushes and looking through the horse's feet and then the trooper's feet into the breezeway where I had walked for 9 years, and I saw these Black kids walking across the breezeway. There's a lot of different kind of language. There were people in town, white people who had wanted the integration. My parents weren't them, but a lot of people saying other things than that. And I just had a sense of identity. They could be me, they could be me. It was kind of what I've called the crack in the cosmic egg. Like, what in the world is all of this force that's just keeping me from going to school, And so those were both moments that, like, I mean, I was a serious little kid and I like to think about things. And I knew I was in trouble, like all my folks are kind of whacked, like they're, I mean, I came to feel that they were exactly wrong. I didn't know quite what to do with it. I was really too young to get to Selma. Another 5 years, I think it would have been Selma. So I was of a generation later. I went to Duke to kind of get out of Alabama and came out as a lesbian. And then all of a sudden, everything started making sense because I understood myself and what my feelings had been, and found a very vibrant lesbian and feminist anti-racist community there, with Kambahi laying the path and the manifesto. And I felt free and liberated, and like this is the path I can follow, and I've done my best for that. But first, I was in Feminary as a lesbian feminist journal, but it was Minnie Bruce Pratt, Chris South. There's a bunch of us who were not leaving the South, but were staying in the South and trying to figure out what the fuck, like, what does it mean to be lesbians here? What does it mean to be materialist here? We were kind of triangulating between conditions and sinister wisdom, kind of witchy, but also materialist, understanding things. What does it mean to be in a culture that was shaped on chattel slavery and genocide? And how do we remap the terrain of the South to include gender and sexuality and the feminist politics, as Kambahi taught us, that was anti-racist, socialist, feminist, broadly liberational, what later came to be called intersectional. After Feminary closed, I mourned for a while because all my buddies left town, and then got the chance to do anti-Klan organizing when the National Anti-Klan Network came along to say that North Carolina had the worst Klans in the country. And by 1985, I was the coordinator of an effort to oppose the Klan, instead of teaching English at a Baptist school, which is kind of what I had been doing. And I did that for 5 years and really like found a politic that was not just as in the women's movement, as Barbara also said, but on the streets of North America. And went on from there, worked with the World Council of Churches, taught at Connecticut College for a while, came back to North Carolina, and since I came back, have been working with Blueprint North Carolina to kind of track insurgents in North Carolina and try to figure out how to counter the very stuff that we were kind of on the precipice of now, which I feel like I have been tracking since I was 13, with more clarity, I think, than I could have there. So that's what brings me here. And it brings me here also, again, to answer Barbara's call, to try to explain and track my own trajectory as an anti-racist white woman within lesbian within this larger framework, and part of an anti-racist movement that's had very courageous and strong participation by white women to counter some of the framing and narratives of fragility, which I found completely counter-revolutionary, almost, I mean, counterproductive, and what it means, like this legacy of courage and how white people get courage, which I think is from Black and brown people. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Mab. Thank you, everyone. I think that is a great way to segue into first the moment that we're in right now, while we're filming this, it's the last day of early voting. We're very much in the middle, in the end, in the midst of the most important election, as many of them are. But this one, obviously, the stakes are really high. There are a lot of folks that I know who have told me that they are like sick to their stomachs about this election. Like they are scared, they are anxious, um, literally nauseous leading up to election day. We're here right now because Barbara and I were having a conversation when the White Women Answer the Call for Harris had just come out recently. And I was feeling very frustrated at that time, generally around this sense of like, where has everyone been? Like, I remember writing scripts when the Roe leak happened during the midterms, and we're talking about Project 2025. And then right now, people are just hearing about it. Like, it's this brand new thing. I was like so frustrated generally at that time, and the sense of like, where were all these white women and their enthusiasm and their money and their time before? Um, and Barbara reoriented me around the long-term struggle and fight that we're in. And Barbara, if you would want to sort of um, add to this around like why it is so important that, yes, this presidential election is happening, but there's such a bigger, longer term struggle that has been happening in this sense of wishing that folks knew this history, that all of this is rooted in, and that they could tap into that sort of patience and resilience that orienting around the long term of it all has. Barbara, would you like to add anything around that?
And thank you, Kristina. So the context, as Kristina has already outlined, is that after the candidate for the Democratic Party changed in the middle of the summer, there was a huge amount of enthusiasm that that rose up then, because the feeling was that now we have a candidate who might actually be able to be successful in this. That was after the disastrous debate between our current president and the one of the former presidents, whose name I don't generally use unless I use it with swear words, and I'm not swearing today. In any event, that whole wave of identity-specific calls, big Zoom meetings that broke Zoom and etc. That whole wave was begun by Black women. What a surprise! And it was begun the day of the announcement. 40,000 or so Black women got on a call that evening and raised over $1 million, maybe more than that, but I'm just talking big ballpark figures. That week then, and that was a Sunday, that week there were other calls, and one of the biggest ones was a white women's call. White women answered the call. This conversation that we're having is not about the election. It sprung up, and the catalyst was the current election that we are going to see something happen on Tuesday. It probably will not be a result, but Tuesday the 5th, 2 days from now, is election day. But in any event, what I was struck by as I watched the big white women's meeting that happened during that first week was that there were white women who were clearly very energized around Vice President Harris's candidacy. And they were saying things like, white women, are we going to show up this time? White women have always let Black women down. We've never listened to Black women. And they were being admirably self-critical, but they also were being, in some ways, to my mind, ahistorical. Because I've been a part of an anti-racist movement, since I've already mentioned, since the 1960s. That's when I entered in, and before I could be a part of the movement because I was too young, we were watching it, just like Mab said, on TV. The Little Rock Nine. We'd come home, my sister and I would come home from junior high school, and we would watch the Little Rock Nine. Emmett Till, we were in elementary school, and we knew that something bad had happened to somebody named Emmett Till. We may not have known exactly what it was, but as I said, I've been a part of anti-racist struggle ever since I had the capacity to comprehend, what racism in the United States and white supremacy is. And so for white women to be saying in the summer of 2024 that there's no tradition of white women ever doing anything except for being toxic Karens, I was just like, let's try to do something. And when I talked to Kristina about that, because this is not a new idea for me, I have often, when I do presentations now, and I don't do that many, but when I do presentations now, I often talk about there was an anti-racist and still is an anti-racist women's movement. You may not know about it, but it actually existed. And today, when I thought about who might we ask to reflect on that and to document that through their own stories and also their own knowledge of the history that came before them, I immediately thought of both Mab and Susan. So that's what we're doing today. This is not about solutions in relationship to electoral politics. This is about movement history and movement struggle going forward.
I've been known to be the person who throws the monkey wrench. So let me throw the monkey wrench. I certainly agree with you, Barbara, that there's a history of women of color and white women working together against racism. I've been part of that history. Experienced it, it changed my life. It changed my life because I was exposed to women of color, Black women, and also, when we were young in Boston, the role of Latinas was we had a huge influx of Latinas came in with the struggles in Puerto Rico and in El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 70s and the early 80s, and those women also had a big impact on us and that multiracial women's movement. I also would say, or propose for thought here, that those moments of white women coming together with women of color and opposing racism are anomalies in history. And I don't think I think there are a lot of anomalies in history. And, for those of us who read the article that Nicole Hannah-Jones just wrote, that she recounts the history around abolition and the women's suffrage struggle and the history around the Equal Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights struggle. And the article is about, whether white women will come to support this struggle of, a Black woman running for president. The picture that goes with the article is a picture of a bunch of white women with one Black woman in the middle. It's very ironic given the tone of the article. But so we know that history. Those of us, who've been feminist historians, we know that history of Grimke. Stanton. Susan B. Anthony, who got her own coin. Phyllis Schlafly. The white women's movement of the 70s, which Betty and Gloria, and I put Gloria in there, even though I think she ended up being a totally different person than how she was perceived by by a lot of women who did not identify with the mainstream women's movement. Okay, so we've got these anomalies. They are anomalies. Why did the anomalies happen? And I think that's important for us to understand, because that's the way we can cultivate this in the future. And my thought is the anomalies happened because we had shared outcomes, shared goals, and shared outcomes, or we had shared spaces. And let me talk some about the shared spaces. The lesbian movement of the 70s, a lot of that coming together happened in the bars. It happened around the culture. Frankly, happened around sleeping together. It happened in our culture, and it spread out from there into our politics, because we had shared spaces and we had shared oppression and bonded around that. We had so there were spaces where we came together. Some of that just, in my mind, there's a whole big gap in that, which I think, Kristina, you kind of sit in that gap for me. So we were impacted, especially in Boston and in other places, we were impacted by the Combahee statement in a deep way. And not just about Combahee, but the other, Audrey and Adrienne and the feminist movement. The impact of those resources, that history, those women and those ideas went kind of underground for a generation or two and got held together in the academy, in the women's studies programs, in many of the programs, many in academia. The women I know who are of those middle generations who know that history, they learned it in college. That's where they learned it. Those are the college-educated women. And then I would say that something really new is happening. And younger women, much more, younger women today, women in their 20s particularly, are much more familiar with the history that we helped make than those women have been in those middle generations. The women in their 20s and their early 30s up to their mid 30s now it's really exciting what they're doing. And they are replicating, they are hopefully not an anomaly, but they are replicating many of the things that caused those historic anomalies in the past, and really exciting things are happening.
If I can tell the story in a different way, I don't see anti-racist white women as I have known them and us as anomaly. I do see us as minority, but I also see us as a consistent trajectory. And one of the first things I started doing, and we started doing in Feminary, is to look for our genealogy, to look for our past, because we didn't figure like we were the first. Yay, we're inventing something. We knew we would have forebears. And maybe we had the advantage of basing ourselves in the South, which is long-term bastion liberation movements, because it's slavery, all the stuff, And so one of the first things I did to write for Feminary is two pieces that were genealogies or kind of family histories of who these folks were. And we could go back to the Grimke sisters, who were some of the first white feminists to oppose slavery and got run out of the South. But then Lillian Smith for Jim Crow. Jesse Daniel Ames, who started the Anti-Lynching Society in Texas, of getting white women together when they heard there's going to be a lynching to come out and stop it. Catherine Dupree Lumpkin, who worked in the YWCA movement in the 1910s and 20s, and I think maybe into the 30s, who did very smart and strategic interracial work in a condition determined by kind of the Jim Crow and a growing apartheid system in the South. Eleanor Roosevelt, who opposed segregation and really brought Black women into FDR's administration and helped to forward, not Southern, but helped to forward women's labor that was able to carry itself over. And Roosevelt was in 1963 chair of the Commission on the Status of Women. I mean, she could bring that whole generation into the South. Carson McCullers, I consider part of that. So we were able to like this is who we draw on. This is who's been thinking about this. This is who we're not alone. And it gave us a subjectivity and a context. And then we knew when we had already entered and we did it together. In seminary, we loved each other. We thought together, we pushed each other. And they were friends that I could go back to when I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing now? In 1993, I was one of 6 lesbians, 3 Black and 3 white, that formed, and we were doing this not in the academy because we couldn't get to the academy. I mean, 2 of us had PhDs because it was a matter of publish and perish. You had to choose between publishing and perishing. And we chose publishing the truth in the women in print movement because we knew that those ideas were too important to leave in the academy, which was so reactionary, really. And so we did listen, Barbara. I mean, this history too, like kitchen table press, all this kind of stuff to keep these ideas, and there were movement ideas and praxis alive. We worked our way into other movements. For the women in seminary, Suzanne was working in the Women's Project. Pam and Carla were working, which was very multiracial and bringing multiracial agency into battered women's movements from the 70s on. Pam and Carla were working with Ann Braden and mentored by her in Kentucky to have queer people be part of this larger radical Black movement. Pat Hussein, African American, had been working against the Olympics and some of the racist stuff that they were protesting in that context. Joan Garner. Mandy Carter, like we were all, when we came to song and created song, which is going for 30 years now, we knew the need for it because we had all been in these struggles continually in various ways and trying to like wrench some gender and sexuality analysis into the SNCC movement, which was also ongoing, which was very tough nuts to crack. And so in 93, when we founded Song, we were friends then, we're friends now. We are friends now. Pam called me the other day. We call Pat, like we can count on each other. And I had this knowledge of how you do this, how you have multiracial friendships, what it means to have people at your kitchen table. When I went to Connecticut College, the first people I befriended, all my friends were women of color. I got to start again and I invited them home and I cooked and we talked about stuff away from the campus. And when they called me and said, white women, let's do this, I would do it, so I have a different experience of that. That's in and out of the academy. When you do that stuff in the academy, sooner or later, somebody's going to take your legs off. You just work as fast as you can, and then you're ready to go on to something else. So I do think that that's a trajectory. I think it's a tradition, and I think it has stuff to teach today for folks everybody's got a stomachache about this motherfuckers, but what do you do with that somatically? How do you have consciousness and courage? And I do not think fragility gets you there. You cannot alchemize fear into courage. You have to have another starting point, such as courageous examples like Barbara Deming, who was one of this trajectory. Minnie Bruce and I drove all the way down from North Carolina to Key West to talk to Barbara because we wanted to know what it was like to be a lesbian in the civil rights movement. And Barbara talked about, and she wrote about being in Albany as a white woman in the church, during the civil rights movement and the music. I mean, just the texture of it. She said she learned courage there. She learned courage. White courage is Black courage. White courage is brown courage because we get in the vibe of it. It's not like some racial DNA. It's like where you put yourself. And those people who have forged that path are still forging it. They are not anomalies. And there's many white people who have been on these movements all along. So with great respect, I do want to just offer a different way to narrate it.
Also, I think that the history you're recounting and the individuals and what they have been able to contribute and sustain, I don't disagree with at all, Mab. What I mean by historical anomalies is one of the cross-class multiracial movements that really make a difference. And I think those are, maybe I should say episodic. They happened around they happened around abolition. It happened around the civil rights movement, happened to some extent around the progressive movements of the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And definitely for me, I personally experienced that in the 1970s and the 1980s here in Boston. It was a cross-class movement. My pessimism around that, and this analysis comes from, it is not white women who are voting against Kamala and voting for Trump. It is working class white women who are not voting for their own interests. And we will see how much, it'd be really interesting to see how class breaks down in those states where there are abortion referendum. Because for me, abortion is one issue that can bring women together across class. But now when we say college educated, we mean what we used to say middle class women. It's the other way of saying middle class women. Middle class women will vote for Kamala. And, I don't know what the numbers are. Women will slightly vote against Kamala it breaks down to class. We do not have a cross-class anti-racial movement of women right now. I'm sure there are places. I know there are places, and I don't mean to make a blanket statement that it doesn't happen, but we don't have that kind of movement that we have had historically in other eras. In fact, we have something that's extremely divisive. And let me just say, I come from that class. I know why those women are making those rotten choices against their own interests. And those are racist reasons.
Yeah.
Barbara, do you want to add anything to this?
Thanks so much.
Please.
We've already heard so much that's so rich, it's just fantastic. I agree with both of you, of course, because I understand where each of you are kind of located and what you've experienced that makes your perspectives about the issues we're talking about accurate. So, yes, I always say about people who've done really meaningful political work, which I always think of as work on the left in this country, at the very minimum progressive, don't have any use for liberals, sorry. But I always say that that we were never a majority. People look at people in our age group, who were young in the 1960s, and they think it was just like fantastic. They think that it was like everybody on campus was really woke, and it was just like massive this and massive that, no pushback. Oh, please, we were a distinct minority. We've always been a minority as people who spoke up. And I'm saying that about all of us, and on people who are not with us today, this afternoon, in this discussion. All of us who speak up are in a minority, but we've made some big differences and big changes in the at least social fabric of the United States, and in some cases the political fabric, not as much as the economic fabric, because that's the hardest, I think, not for us to crack. But as I said, we were never in a majority. So the fact that there's a cohort of white anti-racist women in U.S. history, they had outsized impact on what happened subsequently. I always talk about, I love the Grimke sisters, love the first abolitionist movement, people who are now involved in abolition, which is a great way of understanding where we are with a prison industrial complex and mass incarceration and rogue, policing, police brutality, etc. Abolition is a great way to get into that and figure out which way forward and what do we do next. But the first abolitionist movement, I have a great deal of affection for too, because if not for that, I would still be officially property. So what I say about that abolitionist movement, which was mostly early 1800s and also in England and perhaps some other European countries, but England had a very robust slave trade as well. that if anybody had asked in certain years, let's go back to the 1700s, that they'd ask, and these are just random dates, 1712, 1756, 1802, 1835. If they had asked in any of those years, will Black enslaved people ever be free? The answer would not have been no. It would have been hell no. It was not going to happen because it was too lucrative, it was too profitable for emerging capitalism at that time. It was, I mean, talk about a great scam. Talk about a great way to settle a vast continent, vast continent. First you steal the land. First, you steal the land, you annihilate the indigenous people. The ones you don't annihilate, you force off of their land to other parts of the country that you don't consider to be as, as profitable. And then you look at the situation, and in those days, it was primarily agricultural, not industrial. And you said, oh, we'll just snatch those people from Africa. They're savages anyway. And we don't even convince their people. And we will treat them as if they are beasts of burden. We'll treat them just like our cows and horses, except worse. That's what happened here. But because of people's organizing, including the abolitionist movement, which was not just a white movement, because there were free Black people too, a few, a handful, but there were also the slave insurrections. All of this stuff was destabilizing business as usual. And by the mid-19th century, the North and the South were at war. Over what? Whether people in the first constitutional democracy should be considered to be property. That's what the Civil War was about. And the side that didn't think that people should be property won. The ideas came from the early part of the 19th century. And the Grimke sisters were a part of that. Quakers were very important and all of that as well, even going farther back into U.S. history. So not the majority, undue impact. Same thing with the civil rights struggle, which I lived through. And so no, not every white college student or white young person went south to do voter registration and to do organizing in the Black belts of the South. No, not all of them did, but enough did that with SNCC and leadership and other organizations and leadership, there was a transformation. My social status changed in my lifetime from being a victim of Jim Crow and an official second-class citizen. I'm still a second-class citizen, but the thing is, the perception changed. And when I was born, most Black people in the United States could not vote. Think about it. You today who are partaking of this conversation, you are looking at somebody who, when they were born, most of the people like me could not vote the day I was born. And movements changed that. But let's get back to some of your experiences. As I said, I don't see it as contradictions between you. I just see it as this is what happened with me. This is what happened with me as well. And that thing about class is so important, Susan, because I observe when you introduce yourself, and also Mab, when you introduce yourself, you are pretty clear about your class background. I didn't say anything really about my class background. I'm still trying to figure it out. The reason is because my grandmother from the Deep South, little rural town, all my family was from rural Georgia, she always told my sister and me that we were poor. And since her word was the law, and since she knew everything, I took her word for it. But then when I tell people about some of the things that I got to do when I was growing up, like music lessons, like French classes, like new shoes for every school year, all the things, then I began to understand differently. But one of the reasons that Susan was delighted to find Kabahi is because there were Black women who either identified as working class or who actually were working class. And the lifestyle that I just described to you with the new shoes, and the music lessons and what have you, that was achieved through Black women doing domestic work. But they bonded together, they helped us. It was like a group effort, it wasn't just a nuclear family, it was like all the great aunts, the aunts, uncles, they bonded together so that the children could have a better life.
Can I just respond to one specific thing Barbara said, which I think is so important? You said the impact that the movements we're talking about, anti-racist, multiracial movements, have had on the social fabric. I think that's so important. The right wing in this country has not risen up against the liberal policies to sustain capitalism. They have actually risen up against us. They have risen up against the kind of changes that the progressive women's movement, anti-racist movement have made in society, advancing women, gender issues. Those are our issues. They didn't come from the Democrats or a tail wagging the dog on all those issues. The right wing has risen up in response to the progressive movements of all stripes in this country.
Yeah. Again, I'm very aware of Southern framings. And for 4 years, the South was not in the United States. It was a Confederacy. It was the first modern nation state that tried to found itself on chattel slavery. And it wasn't a good proposition, as some historians have written, because 2/3 of the folks, if you include white women in that, who were having food strikes by 1863 because they weren't getting food from the Confederates supposed to be taking care of them. And they lost, and I think the abolition movement was the biggest labor movement in U.S. history, and emancipation was the biggest labor victory in U.S. history because slaves didn't have to, you couldn't be a slave anymore, at least according to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment really are the Constitution, which Klan would like to eliminate 14th Amendment citizens, which immigrants are and stuff like that. So my experience of Southern history, having lived through one of this, it's not that there are these flashpoints that are anomalies. It's very dialectical. And there's huge victory points like emancipation, and then there's the reaction to it. There's a counterforce, there's a counter-revolution, which becomes, over 50 years, Jim Crow after lynching and all these things. And it takes another 50 years to get the civil rights movement and some of those rights on, and then they immediately start to contradict it to what we have now, which is really fascism. I mean, it's in a different way than we've had to have the Republican Party, as brazen as it is about only power, and somebody like Donald Trump is violent, seeding violence in all the fascists. I mean, he's drawing on all of them there. So what happens in the slumps? I mean, I feel like, especially people in the South, labor, civil rights, queer, all that stuff, when you switch from a slave to a free being in 1865, and then all of a sudden it switches again, it's very nauseating, if you want to say, because when you have those huge periods there, you feel it somatically, even if you're not paying attention. So a lot of Southern resistance history is what you do in those slumps. What do you do during Jim Crow? How do you come out again? And different people had different pieces of it. And I remember, I think Lillian Smith said it, she said, when she was working against segregation in the depth of it and got her house burned 3 times and stuff like that. But she said that she didn't expect a majority of white people to be anti-racist. She expected enough white people to contradict it from inside to break it, to break it so that it was more vulnerable so you could come out the other end. And one of the pieces too of Southern labor history is how much those Confederate states limit the ability to organize in labor, and how much labor movements often case were segregated. I mean, they planned that in the South when the mill villages were established when cotton came south, because they'd been organizing in the North to just be sure only white people got those jobs and black people could be the maids of the white people working there. I mean, that was seeded from the very beginning too. So there's always been that struggle inside, and there've been really progressive interracial labor movements that also got wiped out, So what happens in that interregnum, or what happens when it all of a sudden falls out from under you, which I think is what you're talking about, your friends having that feeling of, holy shit, it is alarming. There is no way that this situation is not alarming, but people have lived through this before and have had to be not fragile, but agile in making these contradictions and figuring out other ways, like in early 1960s, black people in Mississippi who had NAACP cards buried them in a little tin box in the backyard, like you could not organize openly. And we may be moving into a set of circumstances where we can't organize, we can't be C3s, we can't, chat like this on Zoom. I mean, we don't have those forms of organizing that other people have had to learn in these circumstances. And class is absolutely important to it, both in terms of I mean, I do feel like Trump's base is the people who lost NAFTA. I mean, the people who lost NAFTA are just huge trade-offs, and certain people, certain industries, certain working class people who, I mean, all those states lost NAFTA. And I remember learning all that stuff from working with Southerners for Economic Justice, working in urban rural mission, against those movements in multiracial but very working class formations that I was privileged to be in as somebody who came from middle class. But my real education was in those movements. It was never at Duke, which I didn't learn shit there. So
I think that part of what is adding to this context is the capitalism of it all, and
Right.
that the fight for liberation doesn't quite make money like war does, and there are reasons why, why would this current world be uplifting stories of like queer women of color, uh, you know, fighting for liberation, so there is so much impactful work that has happened that people are just not going to know about unless we're doing things like this, and until enough people realize that this struggle impacts them, whether or not they've noticed it yet. And I think that the intersection of queerness here, for example, that I know for me became an access point to see all of the systems of oppression, and I had the luxury of time and curiosity, and again, my queerness, to want to understand these systems of oppression. Mab, you were talking about remapping the South and the conversations around the labor movement, and I think a lot about where I grew up and how the white women really don't have places to create a sense of community outside of church or maybe like a garden club. Unions aren't like they're there, but something that I would love to hear from you all is sort of like, what are the things that are being or feel like they have been erased, that if in this moment we were building and cultivating more of that, this sort of like flashpoints of the presidential election wouldn't necessarily be everyone's focus, like other ways that people have plugged into this long-term struggle and been able to meet people of different class, race, beliefs, all of that.
The trans movement is that right now, and it fits a lot of what we've said. It's a minority. It is multiracial. Is all genders. Like this is revolutionary. We haven't had a moment. We've had moments of two genders. We haven't had a moment of all genders. And it's marginal. The community itself is marginal, and yet it's having a tremendous impact on politics. So I think, this is it can be just really scary when it gets reduced to whether, a trans woman can play, as scary and stupid, whether a trans woman can play soccer or something like that. But what's really happening out there is neither scary nor stupid. It's extremely exciting.
I would say that the Palestinian solidarity movement that has really grown so much since October 7th, 2023. And now, of course, we're into a second year of genocide and ethnic cleansing. But that kind of cross-class, multiracial, all genders, that's where I see it, maybe because I'm involved in it, so I'm around and with people who are working.
Here.
Yeah, but that's a place that we see it, and some of that is college campus based, but kids in college, they're not having the same kind of experience that, say, I had when I went to college, because college was much more elite and much less accessible before. In my era, there was no affirmative action. Now there's no affirmative action again. But the thing is that there was a period when getting people into higher education for skills, and for all the other benefits that higher education or advanced education gives to one, it was open to new new groups and new populations. So I just heard someone talking, in another webinar I was watching yesterday and today, about how so many of the people involved in the Palestinian freedom movement are students of color and first in their family to go to college. I do. This is getting in the Wayback Machine, but I just want to mention, if people are interested in looking at movements that focused on racial equality or whatever, anti-racism, to look at the movements of the 1930s, which were primarily communist led. The Scottsboro Boys, other kinds of issues, labor, organizing, things that were happening in the early 1930s, often with Communist Party leadership and other left party leadership that was subsumed with World War II. The focus then became winning, the war against fascism, and then what followed quickly after that was incredible repression of the left with McCarthyism, and we're still in that period now. But as I said, that is another great point in U.S. history when things were a bit different. There were some wonderful Black women leaders during that time. I'm thinking of Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones is a person that I'm thinking of during that era. And also Ella Baker.
Yeah, I appreciate your question too, Kristina. Even as we're in, this Democrat-Republican struggle in which one side is all out for authoritarian power, it surely shows the weaknesses of the Democratic Party, and the inability to address the situation in Gaza, ongoing genocide, is a horrifying example of that, when the United States is funding those 2,000-pound bombs that are dropping on Gaza and now in Lebanon, and it could draw us into nuclear war. I mean, apparently Biden, the one thing he might have been able to do is to keep Netanyahu dropping a bomb on a nuclear plant. When I think about today, as opposed to like the 1980s and early 90s, like there was this vigorous international solidarity movement. It, it dealt with struggles in in Nicaragua and in Latin America with dictatorships there, some of which were seeded by Nazis who came over those countries. And South Africa was a major point in terms of racial repression. And people could travel back and forth. And if there was like repression in one country in Latin America, the Organization of American States could visit and you could smuggle out little notes about who was being tortured, and there would be global pressure. And I feel like somehow that has like disappeared. And I think that the war on terror disappeared it because there were a series of UN conferences, Habitat and women's rights and race and so forth. And the very last one was race, and it happened in South Africa. And people couldn't get back to this country because there's no 9/11. And this whole discourse on terror really repressed those movements, changed the enemies for a while. And so today I don't think we really have those global connections, and they're being radicalized to the right very rapidly. And I think that that's part of our inability to respond to Israel's attacks. There's too many things that filled in the gaps and just insist that you can't keep doing this there. I mean, it's terrible that we're protecting democracy against Trump, and yet we're funding Netanyahu is at least as right, if not further right, to just decimate people over there. I mean, that's a contradiction that we can't live with. I mean, we won't live with as we go forward. So to say like international solidarity, to be able to do that, and I think whatever happens and whoever gets it in the election to really like increasingly insist, but so. But on the positive side, where the movements that we've done do come forward, I mean, I've never seen issues of reproductive justice to the fore. I mean, to have abortion turn into that kind of framing that Loretta Ross and folks did on reproductive justice, not anti-abortion or choice or whatever, to have that so front and center. And I mean, for Michelle Obama to give that incredible speech where you just kind of broke down women's bodies for men. And I think that was across class too. So it's a time of great contradictions. We're all going to ride them to see, what the end's going to be.
I just want to raise up a niche area that I've worked in for the last over 25 years, which is the union construction sector. So first of all, unionization, the unions, if it hasn't happened already, it's in the next few years, more unionized workers in this country will be women than men. And those are in sectors that are predominantly people of color. So the most progressive unions in this country now are dominated by people of color, and they're in the service unions, and they are progressive. They're coming out against the war against Gaza and Palestine. They're coming out against sending out tax money for bombs, and they are coming out for against Trump and for the other candidate. The construction sector has been a long time, since the beginning of construction unions in this country, a conservative drag. So beginning around, we started in the 70s and it stalled for a long time. One of those episodic, I will say, points. We had a moment in the 70s and then we went into a dormant state. But beginning early in 2000, a movement has grown in this country to get women into those jobs. And now in the apprentice sector, 10% of the women are, 10% of the union apprentices in this country are women. Those are women of color. More than half of the women in the construction industry across this country are women of color. And of course, some percentage of them do meet the stereotype that all the women who go into construction are dykes. Not all of them, but some percentage of them do. So what you have, in my proposition to you early in this, that these changes happen when there are spaces and common goals, when there's space and passion where people meet each other. And I think Barbara's example of what's happening around Palestine is a great example of that. Well, these are people who work together every day in a dangerous situation. making something that they can look back and say, I built that. I was on a Zoom just last week, just a week ago today, with some women who were in a writing residency, and one of them is a union construction worker. And she said on this issue of what's happening with women now, she said, where we work, we women construction workers, we are sitting in the belly of the patriarchy, and we are taking that on and we are changing it. And it is. In the cities around the country where women have really, and people of color have grown in these industries, the unions themselves have changed. They may not be coming out for the most progressive positions, but they're also not acting as that right-wing conservative drag on issues. So that is another place where the people we're talking about they are together. It is a niche. Not all of us have the opportunity to know about it, but they are making significant changes socially and economically.
I'm also seeing union wins increasing. UAW, the organizing at places like Starbucks, even Amazon. They're teachers unions. Let's not forget the teachers unions. So I think that we are seeing an ascendance of consciousness and work around unionized workplaces. I was talking with someone again last week, and I won't say where they work exactly, but it is a not-for-profit, and they have a union now. I said, wow, okay. And it's a social justice not-for-profit. So even those are not immune or safe from workers' rights and fear of pay and benefits, etc. I think that we're probably going to be concluding soon, and I have a question or a topic that I want to make sure that we address. I would like to hear both of you, Mab and Susan. I would like you to talk about any kinds of qualities, characteristics, attitudes, points of view, whatever it is that have allowed you to continue to do the kind of work that you do. Like, what advice would you give to white women specifically, and then maybe white people of all genders, more largely, what would you tell white people about, well, this is how I was able to hang in? I'd love to hear that.
So I use this in my organizing, particularly when I was doing, organizing in the unions with workers, and I was doing health and safety organizing. I was like, how exciting is your life? It's not. You go to work, you go home, you do the kids, you do the shopping, you watch TV, you get up, you go to work. How exciting is your life? Now, what if you call it a hobby? What if you took up trying to change the world? Really trying to make a difference in life? You can. We can change the world. And, I've said this many times when I'm trying to recruit organizers. And someone said to me once, this was years ago, somebody I was organizing, once you see it, you can't stop. You can't not see it. They can't stop. We see people drop up. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it, the injustice. And, for me, I'm the white lady who brought the cheese and beer to Combahee River Collective after they had their meeting in the living room of the collective house I lived in. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it.
And that was solidarity. We had solidarity. And it's really hard to explain to people who've not experienced that, what that meant. We were a part of each other's families, You couldn't get married back then, but as I've explained to people who were not a part of the community, there were people who were married to each other, without state sanction. Who needs that anyway? And raising kids and doing all the things that families do together. The lesbian feminist community of the second wave, which would be 1970s, into the early 80s, was probably the most multiracial cohort of people in the United States at the time. I'm not talking about the white gay male movement. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about lesbian feminists who had a value system that said all people like us are valuable, all people who are experiencing oppression because of, assigned gender, we didn't have the language around uh, all the other all the other identities that exist. We didn't have trans liberation to get our language from. But the thing is, there was solidarity, and there was a strong, strong commitment in some of those sectors to fighting racism. The National Women's Studies Association conference, and the National Women's Studies Association started in the late 1970s. 79, I think, was the first national meeting, this first national conference, because it was the same year that 12 Black women were murdered in Boston in a very short period. Which, you want to see some solidarity? We were all in it. We were all in it together, trying to do something about people being unalived. And so in 81, just a few years later, 2 years later, in fact, the conference at Storrs, Connecticut, at the University of Connecticut, it focused solely on racism. That was the National Women's Studies Association. Does anybody know that there was a women's conference that was not held by a people of color organization that focused on racism? Of course they don't, because the history isn't written. But soon it's going to be more accessible, because I'm preparing my papers of 50 years accumulation for an archive. So soon people are be able to go and see those papers. When I say soon, I'm talking about a couple of years from now. But they will be able to go and see this stuff, and then they will get more than a clue. They'll get a few clues.
Well, I think I was lucky to be kind of birthed, or like my little chick coming out, pecking out of the egg at a certain point in my young life. Like I came into adulthood, really was galvanized into it when I came out, a process of coming out, which was very much implicated in having the tools to go back and understand my childhood and these systems. But I do feel like for the generation of us who came out, and this wasn't only us that it ever happened to, but I remember certainly for me, I mean, we could have lost everything. We could have lost mother, father, siblings, lost a couple of my siblings to that, our jobs, our lives, our health, like all of those things. But I had to decide to do it anyway. Like, how much is my life worth? What is the cost to me if I don't have this somatic move towards freedom? I mean, towards something different, towards something that makes sense to me, and this world doesn't make sense. I mean, I didn't expect to live past 33. I mean, I got to 34, it's like I have outlived Jesus. But it was because I had something to live for. And I understood that. And I understood the historical context of it. And I had new friends who were like amazing. And the more so-called integrated I got from a very segregated childhood with Black people all around me, the richer my network became, the more determined I was in this very concrete way that wasn't just abstract or Jesus might have said it or something, but these are my friends and you fucking can't have them, like you cannot have them. And it's been a very rich life. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And we're going to die sometime, some of us sooner than others. So what is our life about? And I do feel like for the younger people who are feeling, a good bit of tumult, I mean, look, everybody's got a stomachache from this at one time or another, but how do you anchor yourself? And at what point does this generation decide, like, what is my life worth? And it might be that white people, white middle class, like it's going to, like, I mean, Black youth, I mean, can get, Black people can get killed at a traffic light, all these fucking, selling cigarettes, I mean, can just, like anytime. And so there's that kind of existential issue that either you get, like, and I can't speak to that, but I can recognize as part of the ball game, and it's in more intense than I'm talking about. But I was glad to have that, and we just have to know, like, what's it worth, and you really willing to take recourse in passivity, justified by somebody telling you that white people are fragile. When what the fuck, you don't have to be fragile. Go do something, like there is a path and maybe we haven't laid it out clearly enough, or maybe it's been obscured more. But there's plenty of places for this generation to find this path. Environmental movement, pro-Gaza movement, reproductive freedom movement, all of those things that we will increasingly have to reinvent, I think, after Wednesday, to find all the best practices and where they and I appreciate this effort to really try to track where some of the breakthroughs were, where the lapses were, but it's about what we have to build on, because we'll never have to start all over again, however much we're persuaded to do that. And this is worth our lives, it's worth our lives.
Yes. Barbara,
And guilt is unnecessary. Guilt is completely unnecessary. There's just no reason to be. Just jump in.
Yep.
Jump in, and I belong to a group of people that would be African Americans and Black people, more generally. We're a lot of fun, we really are a lot of fun. And if you look at social media, I mean, we rule, on social media, particularly around humor. I mean, so quick, so quick. I think we're a lot of fun. I think a lot of people are afraid of us, because they know we have an incredible right to be furious. Yeah. And a lot of us are very angry. That would include myself in that. But I have found ways through struggle, and through political, organizing, that we come back. We can come back another day. And one of the things that I talk about too is that there's some people who think that white people who think, well, the reason we should include people of color is because we're supposed to, or because we should. They never understand they're missing half of life. They never understand that the more different kinds of people you have in whatever particular enterprise or space that you are operating in, the better off you're going to be. I have found that to be true. It was Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. It was a press for all women of color. And it wasn't, so many people say, well, you started a Black women's press and it was a Black women's press. I said, it was not a Black women's press. It was a press for all women of color. And the most fun I had as a publisher was when we published not one, but two books by women, Mitsue Yamada and Hisaya Yamamoto, both of whom had been in the concentration camps during World War II. And they used Japanese language in their beautiful writing, both poetry and fiction. And the only way that we could figure out if there were any typographical errors was to spell out the words, because we didn't know what they were, so we literally read those books out loud. One of the people who I work with, longtime friend, from Kitchen, I met through Kitchen Table. We literally read those books out loud. Why? Because they were in Japanese. We knew nothing. But is my life better for having done that? So many wonderful things that we could do together in the world if we were not afraid, and if we just, decided to have, as Susan said, a life that's not dull. How exciting is your life?
And I am not afraid.
When I think about everything that you've done and accomplished, it's overwhelming. And I just want to put it out there for folks who might be watching, who are overwhelmed and don't know where to start, is that it really is so valuable to talk to the people that you know in your life. It's like one step in front of the other, and that leads you to this other thing, that leads you to this other thing. And that's how everyone here can talk about, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But it's not like you all knew where you were going, other than trusting that your life and other people's lives depend on you staying in the struggle, and what are your specific contributions. And that this sort of hero mentality, it's important that individuals are doing important things, but doing little things that adds up. And then you end up like these folks in the room who have contributed so much. But you have to start somewhere, and your family is a really good start. Your workplace is a really good start. Any last minute bits that you all want to add?
And I would say about your family and your workplace, I'm thinking of workplace, you don't have to approach people with a big political agenda. It's about, you know, we're going to be going to whatever kind of game this weekend. Would you like to go? When I moved to where I live now, and it was a pretty different racial demographic, 40 years ago when I did move, I would like go to like a political film or something like that. I'd look around. And of course, at that time, there's a lot around Central America, solidarity. And I look around, I said, oh, so it's a group of progressive white people who have no friends of color. They don't hang out with people of color. Can I trust them? Probably not. And you see what I'm saying? It's like, invite somebody to do something with you that you think would be fun to do. Cookout, barbecue, birthday party, bowling, whatever, That's how you get to know and like people, because all of us as humans on the planet, we have similar challenges and things that we have to do and try to do and get done. So, like when you go with somebody to the laundromat, or the supermarket, or give them a ride to a doctor or something like that, or they give you a ride to a doctor, things become different. They do. It doesn't have to be big. And, like all of us in some ways are like kind of, I don't know, academics, and we think about things a lot, and blah blah blah. It doesn't have to be like that. Just like go with somebody to the supermarket, then go home and make some food together.
You know, one thing about kind of the relevance to this, people who might see it in the future, is what we've been talking about is the history, and I think it's good that we've had some tension and in our perspectives, and give people hopefully an opportunity to to open up their discussions. But I think one of the importance of this, and I want to overplay my role in this, is that I think this is a piece of, I think we're on the verge of a coming age of women. And I'm very serious about this. I think we see it in the culture, we see it in literature, see it in film, we see it, I hear it. I say this to young women all the time. Men have had 10,000 years. How's it going? It's not. And I think that we are on the verge of something really historic that's going to take a while to unroll, 100 years maybe. And I think as it unrolls, I think that the lessons of not just the four of us, but many women who've had this experience, it's important to have a document of that. It's going to be really valuable in the future as those women, not just the leaders, as those women who come into their own leadership are taking over. I wanted to say that.
But I mean, when I was, thinking about these whole questions and everything, I just remembered when my daughter Annie was like 5 or 6, and she was terrified, like to be in a room where the door wasn't open. It had to be open everywhere, and we figured we needed to figure out what was underneath this. And I had some time in the afternoon, and we cast a circle and we lit some candles, stuff like that. And I had a mask in the middle, and just picked up the mask. And I said, Annie, what are you afraid of? She said, well, Mom, I was locked in the bathroom with Chloe, and we thought we would never get out. But we did. I said, well, that was no wonder you're so scary. And we talked about that for a while. And then I said, do you have a question? She picked up the mask and she said, why do I give my power to my fear? And this was 6. She knew she had power, and she had figured out she could make a different choice. Like we have many loci, like we have so much inside of us that wants life, that wants possibility, that wants better relationships, and that's curious, that's loving, that's all these things. And we just need to, like in moments of crisis, which this country is really in, like how do we tether ourselves? How do we like act out of those possibilities and choose other things? And if she could do it at 6, I think we could do it now.
Beautiful. What a lovely way to end. thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for doing
Thank
this,
you.
Christina.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
for doing
you
this.
so much.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, I really appreciate that.